So this morning we're going to wrap up this series that we've been in called How Big Is Your God? And we're doing this because I am deeply convinced that the way that we live, the way that we actually go through life is a direct consequence of the size of our God. And the problem that we often have when we're having serious problems is that our God is too small. And so as we move into the final week of this series, I want us to think, as we close this out, about how big God's grace really is. Because from the very first human beings onward, people have struggled to fathom the depth of God's grace. And you think about the very first sin. How did the first people respond? We're told that they hid. Okay, they were ashamed, and so they hid. And so what does God do? God comes calling to them. He says, "Where are you? Where are you?" And he gently invites them out of hiding, and he patiently and very graciously restores them, and they realize, whoa, God is bigger than our guilt. Now, if we come to understand this about God, if we really come to understand this about God, it changes everything. But if we live with a shrunken God and a diminished view of his grace, we can quickly find ourselves enslaved with guilt. We find ourselves plagued by this sense that we are falling short, that God is disappointed, that we're not enough, and that because we're not enough, he opposes us. And rather than coming to him then for grace, we hide. And so, guys, I want to start by saying something. If you've been around Brookview, I've said this over and over and over. But we all fall short, right? Every single one of us falls short. We all sin. We don't like that word, but we do. And now, some of us are wild, sensational sinners, right? And some of us are very dull, very boring sinners. But we all sin. We all do things that we shouldn't do. We do things that we don't even want to do. We don't believe in, things that violate our own principles. And so I think we can all relate to the struggle that Paul talks about in Romans chapter 7. He says, "I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. For I do not do the good I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep on doing. So I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me." So there's this type of life that we want to live. And then there's the life that we actually live. There's the type of person that we want to be, and then there's the person that we actually are. And there's this gap. And when that gap becomes painfully real to us in a moment or in a season of life, when we know that we really are falling short, that we've blown it, how we handle the reality of that gap is so critical. And our view of God in those moments, in those seasons, makes all the difference. This morning, I want to look at the stories of two different guys. Both were friends of Jesus, very close friends. And both blew it with Jesus big time. The first guy is Peter. And Peter is someone who lives with just incredible passion, feels things deeply. And for me, I love Peter's emotion. He wears his heart on his sleeve. You never have to guess what Peter's thinking. Peter is an act first, think second kind of guy. So usually, while the rest of the disciples freeze, Peter acts. One time the disciples are on a boat in a major storm, and they are freaking out because they're feeling like they're going to die. And suddenly, Jesus comes walking to them on the water. And before they can really get their minds around it, Peter is out of the boat, and Peter is out there walking with Jesus. Another time that Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say I am? Now, that's like a non-threatening question. So they all jump on that one. They're like, well, Jesus, some say that you're John the Baptist. Others say that you're Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But then Jesus puts it back on them and he says, okay, but who do you say I am? Well, that's a bigger deal. There's like a right and wrong answer. And so there's this awkward silence. The disciples are like, They just kind of look at each other. Well, right? And while everybody else freezes and there's this awkward moment, Peter just puts himself out there and he says, you are the Messiah. Okay, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, okay, which means rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And I imagine Peter sitting there with Jesus saying this to him going, cool. And then Jesus starts telling the disciples that he's going to suffer and die. Like immediately after this, he just launches into this, that he's going to suffer and die. And of course, they're all in shock. They're just like looking at each other. And so again, Peter steps up to do something, to take action. He pulls Jesus aside, right, with it, like with an arm around him, and he says, first of all, Jesus, this whole like suffering and dying thing, it's just not going to happen. Because here's why. Because I would never let that happen to you. As if Jesus needs like Peter to protect him. And second of all, Jesus, you got to stop talking like that around the guys. Like, I don't know if you know this, it's bad for morale. Like we're trying to start a movement, right? And so I don't want to tell you how to do it or anything, but you should try being more positive. And Jesus looks right back at Peter, right in the eye, and he says, get behind me what? Satan. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men. Jesus doesn't really sugarcoat stuff, does he? Like, have you ever been at work and it's like a brainstorming session or like a think tank and you throw out an idea and your boss stands up and goes, Satan! Like you think about, like on one hand, Peter, just a second ago, Jesus is like, you're the rock, and I'm going to build the church on you. You're the foundation of the church. On the other hand, he's like, no, you are Satan incarnate. And Peter's this guy who just takes a lot of risks, and sometimes he wins and sometimes not. But Peter is a guy who follows his passions. He feels deeply. He acts decisively, quickly, not always wisely. But one thing's for sure about Peter, okay, he's not just going to sit around doing nothing. And we see his personality coming out on the night of the Last Supper. Jesus celebrates the Passover with his disciples. And they have this, like the most intimate of dinners together. Before the meal, Jesus washes their feet. Okay, their leader does something that only a slave would do. He's teaching them about humility. And after the meal, they worship. And they sing together. Then they go to the Mount of Olives, this incredibly beautiful place, picturesque with a view, the Mount of Olives to pray. And Jesus tells them that during his suffering and his death, which he comes back to again, that all of them will fall away. He says, guys, this is happening, and you will all fall away. And so, of course, Peter speaks up, and he's like, Jesus, did you say that we'll, like, all fall away? Like, really? Because clearly you've forgotten that I'm here. This is Mark chapter 14, verses 27 to 31. It says, you will all fall away, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. Peter declared, even if all fall away, I will not. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. So here they are in the Mount of Olives, right? This unbelievable setting. They've celebrated Passover. It's been so intimate. They've worshiped. They've prayed. Jesus has shared his heart with them. They feel deeply connected to Jesus, and they feel deeply connected to one another. This is one of those moments. I think we've all had something like this. So when Jesus says to them, here in this moment, you will all fall away, they cannot imagine that. There's just no way. So Peter says, like, even if everybody else falls away, I will not. In other words, Jesus, I don't know about these losers, but I'm your guy. I'm with you. And then he adds on, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Now, guys, have you ever been there? Like, have you ever felt like that with Jesus? Because I think when Peter says this, he absolutely means it. I mean, he's in the most intimate setting imaginable with Jesus, and he is so filled in this moment with passion and devotion. He can't possibly imagine ever betraying Jesus. So when he says, Jesus, I would die for you, he absolutely means it. Like, have you ever felt like that? You ever had a moment where you experienced Jesus so powerfully? Maybe it's at camp. Okay, maybe it's in a church service, maybe it's when you're praying, but something tangible and real happens and it grips you. You have a moment of clarity where you get a glimpse into how unbelievable Jesus actually is. And you know that it's real, and you know that it's right, and you know that it's true, and you feel in that moment, okay, that you would give anything for Jesus. Well, Peter's in that place. Jesus in this moment is more important to Peter than life itself. Even if all fall away, I will not. Even if I have to die with you. So fast forward just a little. Just a few hours later now. Jesus is praying in the garden. Peter's struggling to stay awake, which we got to give Peter a little grace. It's late at night, man. It's been a full day. But the company of soldiers comes to arrest Jesus. And true to his nature, Peter springs into action. He was sleepy. The soldiers arrive. He's like, whoa, I'm awake now. And he whips out his sword, and he goes nuts. And he cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers, right? Peter's like, never will you take Jesus. And he like cuts the guy's ear off. And Jesus is standing there going, Peter, man, like, would you cool it? Like, this is not the way. And so Jesus goes over, it doesn't say how this happened. I imagine Jesus kind of picking the guy's ear up off of the dusting the dirt off and going, all right, here. Sorry about my friend. He's, he gets a little aggressive. And then to Peter's amazement, Jesus allows himself to be arrested. Now, Peter has seen Jesus feed thousands. Peter has seen Jesus calm storms. Peter has seen Jesus do unbelievable things. And so Peter is confused, utterly confused by all of this. This is not supposed to be how things go. Jesus is supposed to become the king. There is supposed to be a revolution and a new kingdom. They're supposed to overthrow the Roman government and all the oppression. And Jesus is supposed to be the king, and they're supposed to be his right-hand men. And this is the movement. This is what was predicted as far as their understanding goes in the Old Testament. And they're like, it's happening. Look at the signs. This is what's going to happen. And now Jesus is being dragged away in chains. And we're not told, but I wonder if maybe Peter's battling some doubt. Like, if Jesus is the Christ, where's the revolution? Where's the kingdom? This isn't how it's all supposed to go. What is happening right now? And so Peter is entering into this dark hour, total confusion. So we fast forward a few hours. This is Luke chapter 22, starting with verse 54. Says, then seizing him, they led him away and took him into the house of the high priest. Peter followed at a distance. And when some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, this man was with him. But he denied it. Woman, I don't know him. he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are one of them." "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is Galilean." Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Then the Lord turned. He's in the courtyard. Then the Lord turned and looked straight at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord had spoken to him. "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Whew, what a roller coaster. Can you imagine what that must have been like? As he denies Jesus for the 3rd time, Jesus, who's now in the courtyard, bloody and beaten, looks at Peter and they lock eyes. Can you imagine that? And I just want to say, have you ever been there? Have you ever had a moment where you know you have totally blown it with Jesus? Like, have you ever vowed to do, not to do, whatever it is you tend to do? Like, have you ever had a moment with God where you say, like, okay, look, I'm never going to do that again. Okay, I'm never going to betray you like that, Jesus. From here on, I am living for you. But then, see, the pressures of life happen. Circumstances change. And you're not at camp, or you're not in church, or you're not listening to that music, or you're not with those friends anymore, and the pressure comes, and the temptation comes, and you betray Jesus. Like, have you ever been there? I want to look quickly at another famous person who betrayed Jesus. I want us to think a little bit about the story of Judas. Now, like Peter, Judas was a follower and a very close friend of Jesus for 3 years. Okay, like Peter, Judas left behind everything to follow Jesus. He saw the miracles, he ate and walked with Jesus, and like Peter, Jesus loved him. Jesus loved Judas. And you cannot convince me that Judas was not sincere at first. I think Judas loved Jesus. I think he was powerfully drawn to Jesus. I think he was truly a friend of Jesus. I think he believed. But somewhere, somehow, something went horribly wrong. And we know the story. Judas sold out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And as we know, Judas led the soldiers to Jesus to arrest him. He worked this whole thing out. As a disciple and as an intimate friend of Jesus, he did the unthinkable. And the level of remorse and guilt he experienced is unimaginable. This is Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 to 5. It says, "Early in the morning, all the chief priests and elders of the people made their plans how to have Jesus executed. So they bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate the governor. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. 'I have sinned,' he said, 'for I have betrayed innocent blood.' 'What is that to us?' they replied. 'That's your responsibility.' So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself." Now, guys, I want us to really think about this, and I want to ask you a serious question. You know, what Judas did to Jesus, what Judas did was unthinkable. But was it unforgivable? You think about the heart of Jesus for a second. Do you think Jesus could have ever forgiven Judas? I do. I really believe that the love of Jesus extends that far. I think that the payment on the cross that Jesus made for all people of all time, for all sins, would cover even Judas. And so you think about this and you go, what if Judas hadn't given up on the grace of God? Like, imagine with me. What if Judas actually experienced the forgiveness of Christ? What if Judas would have encountered later on the resurrected Jesus? And what if Judas would have moved beyond remorse? And what if he would have repented and cried out to Jesus? Now, I'll just tell you what I think. I think Jesus would have forgiven him. I think this could have been one of the most tender moments in history. There could have been healing and joy on unspeakable levels. And I think about what his life could have been after that. I mean, imagine the ministry that he could have had, the story that he would have had to tell. I mean, imagine if there was a book in the Bible written by Judas, like there was Peter and Paul and John. And what if that story in that book was just a message of unthinkable grace? How powerful. And what if Judas had been a part of the story of the early church? What if God had used him to do something amazing, but it never happened? Judas could not fathom that Christ's grace could possibly extend that far. And I just want to say to you guys, have you ever been there? Have you ever felt like what you've done is so bad, or you've messed up, or you've done that thing so many times that now you are beyond grace? Maybe you're here this morning and you're in that place right now. Like you've struggled with something so deeply or for so long that deep down you wonder if maybe God has just kind of given up on you. And if that's you, I just want to challenge your picture of God. Guys, when we mess up, when we fall short, and we all do all the time, our picture of God really, really matters. It can completely change the trajectory of our lives. Let's shift away from Judas and back to Peter. Peter was also seized with remorse. Okay, he went out from the courtyard and he wept bitterly, we're told. Peter was also devastatingly ashamed. Peter's world was also rocked by what he had done. But Peter didn't give up. Peter pressed on. And Peter encountered Jesus again. And that encounter changed everything. I mean, let's look at what happened with Peter and Jesus in John chapter 21. This is after Jesus is raised from the dead now. It's after Jesus has appeared to the disciples a few times. And on this particular morning, Jesus has just had breakfast with them. And this is John chapter 21. We're starting with verse 15 now. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. So Jesus gives Peter the chance to affirm 3 times now his love for Christ. He explains that eventually Peter's love for Jesus will cost him his life. That in the end, his devotion will lead to suffering and eventually it will lead to death. And then Jesus looks straight at him. Jesus says, follow me. Now, 3 years earlier, on the shores of that same lake, Jesus had spoken the very same words to Peter. Follow me. and all the teaching now and all the miles walked together and all the miracles and all of the moments and all of the impulsiveness and all of the failures didn't change the same basic challenge that Jesus gave to Peter and continues to give to you and me. Follow me. And the truth is, following Jesus is more than a step. No matter how powerful the moment is, right? No matter how overwhelmed we are by the environment or what it is we're encountering, it's more than a step. It's more than a momentary decision, right? It is a lifelong walk. And there are bound to be ups and downs. We're human beings. We have emotions. We have struggles. We have weaknesses. There are bound to be ups and downs. There's bound to be failures and growth because this whole thing doesn't happen in a minute. This journey with Jesus doesn't happen in a moment. It is a walk. It's a long journey. It's a lifetime. It's a long road. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us specifically how Peter's story ended. There's an allusion to it here in John. But there are reliable ancient documents that tell us that Peter was crucified under the Roman Emperor Nero for leading the church, for caring for the sheep, for serving the people, and for going all throughout the Roman Empire telling people about Jesus. And they said, "You got to stop." And he said, "I will not stop." And they said, "We'll kill you." And he said, "Okay." Spent his life telling people about the grace of God. He told people about it until it killed him. And he died as a martyr because he refused to quit testifying about the grace of God. The night of Jesus' arrest was not Peter's last opportunity to love Jesus. Like many, many more chances would come, right? Because it's a long journey. It's a long walk. And Peter would eventually get it right. But only because he didn't react like Judas. And maybe you're here this morning and inside of you, even though you're here, there's something that you are deeply ashamed of. Or there's something going on in your life that's been going on for a while and you just feel just defeated by it. There's a part of you that wants to give up on God because you cannot see how God's grace could extend to you. Here's what Jesus clearly revealed to us about God. No matter where we are, no matter what we've gone through, He wants to remake us into new people. He sees potential beauty and strength in us that we can't fathom. And in Christ, God's grace is available to everyone. Jesus extended grace. I mean, just read the Gospels, look at his life. He extended grace to anyone and everyone that cried out to him for it. He extended it to a woman that was caught in adultery. He extended it to a corrupt tax collector named Zacchaeus. He extended it to a lifetime criminal moments before death, a criminal hanging on a cross next to Jesus who simply said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He extended it to a murderer named Saul who became Paul. I think he would have extended it to Judas too, if only. If only Judas hadn't given up on God. If only. Guys, our picture of God, what you envision when you hear the word God, it really, really matters. And the picture that Jesus painted is that God is good and that He is for us all the time. That He delights in renewing and restoring and healing and forgiving. And when we discover this, it changes everything.